My tenant painted my entire house bright blue and said squatters' rights made it his. My tenant Lyle had been renting my property on Maple Street for exactly 18 months. Ever since he'd read some article online about adverse possession, he'd been acting like he owned the place. He'd tell the neighbors he was planning renovations. Tell the mailman this was the Lyle residence now. Even had business cards printed with my property address listed as Lyle's estate. His buddy Frank from the bar encouraged him. Possession is 9/10 of the law, brother. You've been there almost 2 years. That house is basically yours. Lyle had done the math. In our state, adverse possession kicked in at 24 months of continuous occupation if the owner didn't properly maintain oversight. He figured I lived 3 states away, only visited once a year. Perfect situation for a taking. What Lyle didn't know was that I visited every 6 weeks. I just came at night to check the exterior and review my property manager's reports. Last Tuesday, I got a call from my property manager, Janet. You need to see your house. Today. I drove 4 hours thinking maybe there was storm damage or a break-in. What I found was my beautiful Victorian home, the one my grandmother left me, painted electric blue. Not navy, not sky blue. Electric neon, assault your eyeballs blue. Every inch of siding, trim, even the front door. Lyle was on the porch with a beer, admiring his work. He saw me pull up and grinned. Hey, landlord. Or should I say former landlord. Love what I've done with my place? I stood there staring at my destroyed property. Your place? What are you talking about, Lyle? He pulled out a folder of printed internet articles. Adverse possession. I've been here 18 months making improvements, maintaining the property. You barely show your face. Another 6 months and this place is legally mine. Painting it is just establishing my claim, making it clear to everyone that Lyle Wooten lives here now. I looked at the paint job closer. It was even worse than I thought. He'd painted over the vintage brass fixtures, the stained glass window details, everything. This paint job must have cost thousands, I said. Lyle laughed. $8,000, actually. Premium weatherproof paint, 5 coats. Had a whole crew here last weekend while you were sitting in your apartment 3 states away. This is an investment in my future property. Janet was taking photos of everything. She whispered to me, he paid cash. Bragged to the whole paint crew about how smart he was. The neighbors had come out to watch. Mrs. Hendricks from next door shook her head. He had 10 guys here with sprayers. Said you gave him permission to express himself. We knew something was wrong, but he showed us those articles about squatters' rights. My phone rang. It was Tom from the paint store. Hey, I heard about what happened to your grandmother's house. Just wanted you to know something interesting. What's that, Tom? Well, Lyle came in last week, bought $8,000 worth of our premium series paint. Paid cash. But here's the thing. He specifically asked for the stuff that bonds permanently. Said he wanted it to be impossible to remove. Tom paused. That paint he used? It's got lead-based primer underneath. We haven't sold that in 15 years. He must have gotten it from some shady supplier to save money, then covered it with our good stuff on top. I asked Tom why that mattered. Lead paint violations are federal crimes, he explained. EPA fines start at $37,000 per day. And if he disturbed existing lead paint without proper remediation, that's criminal charges. Plus, anyone who knowingly applies lead paint to a rental property they don't own, that's considered environmental terrorism. I thanked Tom and turned to Lyle, who was still grinning like he'd won the lottery. Lyle, did you check what kind of primer you used? He waved me off. Who cares about primer? The important thing is this house is mine now, or will be in 6 months. Janet pulled out her tablet. Actually, Mr. Wooten, adverse possession in this state requires 24 months of hostile possession. You've been here 18. But more importantly, you've been paying rent every month. She showed him his payment history. Adverse possession requires occupation without permission. Every rent payment you made is legal acknowledgement that you're a tenant, not an owner. You can't claim squatters' rights while simultaneously paying rent. Lyle's face went red. Then I'll stop paying rent. Janet smiled. Then you'll be evicted in 30 days for non-payment. An eviction resets any adverse possession claim to 0. But here's the real problem, Mr. Wooten. She pulled up environmental regulations on her tablet. The screen glowed with official government seals and dense legal text. Janet scrolled through section after section, her finger tapping each violation as she read them aloud. Federal law prohibits the application of lead-based paint on any residential property constructed after 1978, and it absolutely prohibits applying it to rental properties, regardless of construction date. She turned the tablet so Lyle could see the numbers. Violations start at $37,000 per day. That's not a typo. Per day. Not a one-time fine. Lyle's grin cracked at the edges. His beer can paused halfway to his mouth. Mrs. Hendricks leaned over her fence to hear better, and I noticed 3 other neighbors had wandered closer to their property lines. This was better entertainment than anything on cable. Janet kept reading. Environmental contamination of a rental property occupied by tenants carries additional penalties under the Clean Air Act and requires immediate EPA notification. She looked up at Lyle. The moment Tom called your landlord, he was legally required to report this. The EPA already knows. Lyle set his beer down on the porch railing. His folder of internet articles suddenly looked very thin compared to Janet's tablet full of actual federal regulations. I pulled out my phone and called Tom back. Can you email me everything you have on Lyle's purchase? Every receipt, every question he asked, everything. Tom's voice came through clearly on speaker. Already compiling it. Give me 5 minutes. Lyle's face had gone from confident red to nervous pale. He tried to recover. You're blowing this out of proportion. I was just making improvements. Tom's email arrived 4 minutes later. I opened it right there on the lawn while everyone watched. The receipts showed $8,000 in premium exterior paint, all paid in cash. But the notes Tom had added were even better. Customer asked specifically about permanent bonding properties. Customer inquired whether paint would be difficult to remove once applied. Customer asked about primer compatibility with, quote, old stock, unquote, products. Janet photographed the email on my phone screen, then started walking around the house with her tablet camera. She documented every blue inch. The vintage brass mailbox now electric blue. The stained glass window surrounds painted over. The decorative trim work my grandmother had maintained for 40 years, obliterated. Lyle followed her around the porch. What are you doing? Making a record of all unauthorized modifications to my client's property. She didn't look up from her camera. Every violation, every damaged historical feature, every square foot of contaminated surface. I called the city code enforcement office next. My tenant painted my rental property without permission and used hazardous materials. The woman on the phone asked for the address. When I gave it, she made a small noise of recognition. The Blue Victorian on Maple? We've had 3 neighbor complaints already. Someone will be there within 2 hours. Lyle tried to go inside, but I blocked the porch steps. You need to stay out here and talk to code enforcement when they arrive. He pulled out his phone and called someone. Frank, it's getting complicated. You need to come over. I could hear Frank's voice through the speaker telling Lyle to stay calm, that he had rights, that possession was still 9/10 of the law. Mrs. Hendricks shook her head and went back to her garden, but she kept glancing over with obvious interest. Hugo Masterson arrived 90 minutes later in a city vehicle with official logos on the doors. He wore a polo shirt with a code enforcement badge and carried a clipboard thick with forms. He walked the property perimeter first, taking photos from every angle. Then he approached Lyle, who was still on the porch looking increasingly uncomfortable. You're the tenant? Lyle nodded. Hugo made notes. Did you obtain permits for this exterior modification? No, but I don't need permits for my own property. Hugo stopped writing and looked up. This isn't your property according to county records. Did you get written permission from the property owner? Lyle gestured at me. He's right there, and no, Hugo turned to me. Did you authorize this paint job? Absolutely not. Hugo made more notes, then pulled out a testing kit from his vehicle. I need to take paint samples. The county lab will test for lead content and other hazardous materials. He scraped samples from 6 different locations on the house, each one going into a labeled evidence bag. Lyle watched the process with growing dread. The confident grin was completely gone now. Hugo finished his sampling and handed Lyle a violation notice. Unauthorized exterior modifications to a rental property. Failure to obtain required permits. Potential environmental contamination. He handed me a copy too. You'll receive the lab results within 24 to 48 hours. If lead is confirmed, EPA will be notified automatically. After Hugo left, Lyle finally dropped the act. He sat down on the porch steps with his head in his hands. Look, maybe I got some bad advice. Maybe we can work something out. I can repaint it, whatever color you want. Janet stood over him with her tablet. Mr. Wooten, that paint is bonded permanently. Remember? You specifically asked for paint that would be impossible to remove. Tom's notes document that. You can't just repaint over lead-contaminated surfaces. That requires professional hazmat remediation. She pulled up more regulations. And you can't do any remediation work yourself. Federal law requires licensed contractors with EPA certification. Lyle's phone rang. He looked at the screen and didn't answer. It rang again. Finally, he picked up. What? His face changed as he listened. Yeah, I'm still at the house. Why? He stood up fast. The EPA is coming? When? He looked at his phone. Tomorrow morning. They want to inspect the property. Janet smiled. That was faster than I expected. Usually takes 3 to 5 business days. Must be a slow week for environmental crimes. Lyle started pacing the porch. This is insane. I was trying to improve the value. I was making the place nicer. I pointed at the electric blue siding. You think this is nicer? You painted over historical features that took my grandmother years to restore. You used illegal hazardous materials. You deliberately chose products that would be permanent. Nothing about this was improvement. It was sabotage. Janet checked her tablet. Actually, Mr. Wooten, painting a Victorian home in a historical district this color without approval decreases its value significantly. I pulled up comparable sales earlier. Similar homes in original condition sell for around $400,000. I showed Lyle the listings on my phone. Your blue paint job? Based on remediation costs and lost historical value, you've decreased this property's worth by at least $50,000. And that's before we factor in the lead contamination. Lyle sat back down. His hands were shaking. $50,000? Plus EPA fines? Plus remediation costs? Janet nodded. Plus my legal fees for handling this situation. Plus lost rental income while the property is uninhabitable. Plus code enforcement penalties. She started adding numbers on her tablet calculator. You're looking at well over $200,000 in damages, Mr. Wooten. Possibly much more depending on how long the EPA fines accumulate. Lyle put his head in his hands again. Frank told me this would work. Frank said squatters' rights were real. Frank said I could claim the house. I sat down on the porch railing. Frank doesn't have a law degree, does he? Lyle shook his head. Frank works at the tire shop, but he reads a lot online. He knows stuff. Janet closed her tablet. Mr. Wooten, reading articles online doesn't make someone a legal expert. Adverse possession is real, but it has very specific requirements that you never came close to meeting. You paid rent every single month. You had a signed lease. You were never in hostile possession. You were just a tenant with delusions. The neighbors were still watching from their yards. I looked at Lyle sitting on the porch steps with his head in his hands. Mrs. Hendricks walked over to her property line and called out to me. I've got something you need to see. She went inside and came back with a folder. These are copies of statements I made for code enforcement. She handed me the papers. I watched Lyle tell that entire paint crew he was claiming this house through squatters' rights. He was so proud of himself. 3 of the crew members gave me their phone numbers because they felt bad about what he was doing. I thanked her and added the statements to my growing file of evidence. Janet was already on her phone. I'm calling remediation companies right now. She spoke with someone for several minutes, asked about lead paint protocols, and wrote down numbers. The first estimate she got was $95,000 for complete hazmat removal and disposal. She showed me the quote on her phone. Lyle looked up when he heard the number. $95,000? For paint removal? Janet nodded. Lead paint requires specialized contractors with EPA certification. Full hazmat suits, special disposal procedures, air quality monitoring. This isn't something you can just paint over or sand off yourself. She pulled up more regulations. If you try to remove it without proper certification, that's additional federal violations. Lyle stood up and started pacing again. I don't have $95,000. I barely had the $8,000 for the paint job. I looked at him directly. You should have thought about that before you deliberately used lead-based primer to save money. Tom's documentation shows you specifically asked for permanent bonding paint. You wanted this to be impossible to remove. Now you're paying for professional removal. Janet added the remediation costs to her tablet. With EPA fines, code violations, and now remediation, you're over $200,000 in damages. And that's before we calculate lost rental income while the property is uninhabitable. Lyle pulled out his phone and started texting someone. Probably Frank. Janet noticed. Calling your bar buddy won't help. The evidence is documented. The violations are federal. The fines accumulate daily. She looked at her watch. You've been in violation for 3 days now. That's $111,000 in EPA fines alone. The next morning, Lyle stopped by the property manager's office. Janet called me immediately. He just tried to stop paying rent. Said he's not paying another cent until this gets resolved. I asked what she told him. That I'm filing eviction paperwork for non-payment right now. The hearing is in 2 weeks. She paused. He actually thinks not paying rent will somehow help his adverse possession claim. The man learned nothing from our conversation yesterday. Over the next week, code enforcement collected more statements. Mrs. Hendricks provided detailed written testimony about what Lyle told the paint crew. She documented dates, times, and specific quotes. 3 crew members also gave statements. They all said the same thing. Lyle specifically instructed them to make the paint job permanent. He told them he wanted it impossible to remove because he was claiming ownership through squatters' rights. One crew member even kept text messages where Lyle asked about the most permanent paint application methods. Hugo from code enforcement showed up at my hotel with a thick folder. I've issued formal violations. He spread papers across the table. Unpermitted exterior work, environmental contamination, reduction of property value in a historic district. The fines total $18,000. Plus, the violations mean Lyle cannot legally occupy the property until everything is cleared. I asked how that affected my eviction case. Hugo smiled. It means even if he tried to fight the eviction, which he can't because he stopped paying rent, he still can't live there due to code violations. You've got him from multiple angles. 2 weeks later, the eviction hearing arrived. I sat in the courtroom with Janet and my attorney. Lyle walked in carrying a folder of printed internet articles, the same articles he'd shown me on the porch. The judge called the case. Lyle immediately started talking about adverse possession. The judge held up one hand. "Mr. Wooten, have you been paying monthly rent on this property?" Lyle hesitated. "Well, yes, but I stopped 2 weeks ago to establish hostile possession." The judge looked at Janet. "Do you have payment records?" Janet handed over 18 months of rent payments, every single one documented and cleared. The judge reviewed them for about 30 seconds. "Mr. Wooten, you cannot claim adverse possession while simultaneously paying rent. Every payment you made is legal acknowledgement of your tenant status. Your claim has no merit whatsoever." Lyle pulled out his articles. "But these say that if you occupy property for long enough." The judge cut him off. "Those articles assume hostile occupation without the owner's permission. You had a signed lease, you paid rent monthly, you were never in hostile possession." She looked at the property damage evidence Janet provided. "You also caused significant damage to the property using hazardous materials." The judge ruled in my favor immediately. Lyle had 72 hours to vacate completely. She also added a restraining order preventing him from returning to the property for any reason. Lyle stood there holding his internet articles. "This isn't right. I did everything the articles said." The judge closed the file. "The articles were wrong. Or more likely, you misunderstood them completely." 72 hours, Mr. Wooten. 3 days later, Lyle was still at the house. I drove over with Janet and found him sitting on the porch with all his belongings packed but refusing to leave. "The house is mine. I'm not going anywhere." Janet pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the sheriff." Within an hour, 2 deputies arrived. They reviewed the eviction order and the restraining order. One deputy walked up to the porch. "Mr. Wooten, you need to leave now." Lyle didn't move. "This is my property. I claimed it through adverse possession." The deputy looked at his partner. "We're going to remove you now." They physically escorted Lyle off the porch and onto the sidewalk. His belongings followed. Boxes, furniture, everything stacked on the curb. Lyle stood next to his stuff, still insisting the house was legally his. Janet had the locksmith ready. While Lyle watched from the sidewalk, the locksmith changed every lock on the property. Front door, back door, side entrance, garage. Mrs. Hendricks came out on her porch to watch. She shook her head at Lyle's continued delusion. "You did this to yourself. Everyone tried to tell you." Meanwhile, Frederick's EPA investigation had expanded. He called me that afternoon. "We found Lyle's supplier. Guy's been selling illegal lead-based paint products to multiple people. Lyle just got subpoenaed to testify about where he bought the primer and why he specifically sought out lead-based products." I asked how that affected Lyle's situation. Frederick explained that cooperation might reduce his personal fines slightly, but the violations still stood. And if he refuses to cooperate, that's obstruction. More charges, more fines. I filed the civil lawsuit the next day. My attorney put together damages for property destruction, lost rental income during remediation, the $95,000 in remediation costs, EPA fines, code enforcement penalties, and legal fees. The total exceeded $300,000. My attorney was realistic about collection. "We'll get a judgment." But Lyle doesn't have that kind of money. We'll be garnishing his wages for the next 20 or 30 years. Small monthly payments that barely cover interest. The remediation crew arrived the following Monday. They showed up in full hazmat suits with specialized equipment. The lead paint removal process was careful and slow. Every surface had to be treated properly. The contaminated materials went into sealed containers for special disposal. Air quality monitors ran constantly. The work took 3 full weeks. I documented everything with photos and detailed receipts. Every day of work, every piece of equipment, every disposal fee. The final bill came to exactly $95,000 as estimated. Frederick completed his EPA investigation 6 weeks after the initial violation. He determined that Lyle's actions were willfully negligent. The evidence showed Lyle deliberately sought out lead-based primer to save money on his paint job. He knew about the hazards but used the illegal materials anyway. The final EPA fines totaled $222,000 for 6 days of violations before remediation began. Frederick filed a formal report recommending criminal prosecution for environmental crimes. The district attorney got Frederick's report 3 days after he filed it. I got a call from my attorney saying the DA's office wanted to meet with me to discuss criminal charges against Lyle. I drove back to town and sat in a small conference room while the assistant district attorney reviewed stacks of documents. She was young, maybe 30, and she kept shaking her head as she read through the EPA violations, the code enforcement reports, and all the witness statements from neighbors and the paint crew. The evidence was overwhelming. Lyle had deliberately sought out illegal materials, applied them to property he didn't own, created environmental hazards, and then bragged about it to everyone who would listen. The assistant DA looked up from the papers and told me they were filing charges for reckless endangerment, criminal property damage, and environmental violations. She explained that normally they might offer a deal immediately, but Lyle's actions were so brazen and well documented that they wanted to send a message. 2 days later, Janet called to tell me Lyle had been arrested at his new apartment. The bail was set at $15,000, which apparently took Lyle 3 days to scrape together. He got released but had to surrender his passport and stay in the county. His court date was scheduled for 6 weeks out. During that time, Lyle hired a criminal defense attorney who reviewed all the evidence and apparently had a very long, very difficult conversation with his client about the reality of his situation. The attorney contacted the DA's office to discuss a plea agreement. I got updates from my own attorney about the negotiations. Lyle's lawyer was trying to get the charges reduced, but the DA wasn't budging much. The evidence was too strong and the violations too serious. After 2 weeks of back and forth, they reached a deal. Lyle would plead guilty to all charges in exchange for avoiding jail time. The plea agreement required him to pay full restitution for the $95,000 in remediation costs, accept the judgment for all civil damages in my lawsuit, and serve 2 years of probation with 200 hours of community service. His attorney told him if he went to trial and lost, he was looking at actual prison time, possibly 2 to 3 years. Lyle signed the agreement because he had no choice. The plea hearing was quick and anticlimactic. Lyle stood before the judge looking defeated and mumbled his guilty pleas to each charge. The judge accepted the agreement and laid out the terms in detail, making it clear that any violation of probation would result in immediate jail time. Meanwhile, the remediation crew had finally finished their work. I drove back to see the house for the first time since they started. My grandmother's beautiful Victorian home looked exactly like it had before Lyle destroyed it. The original colors were restored. The vintage brass fixtures were cleaned and repaired. The stained glass windows were perfect again. I stood on the sidewalk just staring at it, remembering how it looked covered in that awful electric blue paint. Mrs. Hendricks came out of her house and walked over to me. She said she was so relieved to see the place looking proper again that the blue eyesore had been driving her crazy for months. Over the next few days, several other neighbors stopped by to thank me for fixing everything. They all had stories about Lyle's ridiculous claims and his attitude during those weeks when he thought he was going to steal my house. I hired a different property manager to replace Janet, who had done an excellent job but was retiring. I listed the house for rent at a price $200 higher than what Lyle had been paying. The new rate would help cover my losses over time, though I knew I'd never fully recover everything this disaster had cost me. 6 months passed. I got new tenants who were a young couple restoring old homes as a hobby. They loved the Victorians' historic character and treated it with respect. They sent me photos of small improvements they were making with my permission, things like period-appropriate light fixtures and careful garden work. Every month, I got a tiny payment from Lyle toward his massive debt. The garnishment took 25% of his wages, which worked out to maybe $300 monthly. At that rate, he'd be paying me for the next 40 years and still wouldn't cover everything. The math was depressing for him but satisfying for me. I started visiting the property regularly again, not just to check on things, but because I genuinely enjoyed it. Sometimes I'd drive past Lyle's new apartment, a rundown place in the bad part of town, and think about how he'd destroyed his own life over a stupid internet fantasy. Frank apparently stopped hanging out with Lyle after watching his bar buddy lose everything. Mrs. Hendricks told me Frank actually apologized to her for encouraging Lyle's delusion. Tom at the paint store now used the whole story as a cautionary tale. Whenever someone came in asking about cheap primers or trying to cut corners on a paint job, Tom would tell them about the guy who thought he could steal a house with blue paint and lead-based primer, then ended up with a criminal record and debt that would follow him forever.